Hello everyone, today we talk about the organization of Charles the Bold's army, so the Burgundian army fundamentally of the late 15th century, and it's a topic that I have had the opportunity to cover at this point somewhat frequently, discussing something about battle formations, equipments, flags, but never quite detailing the military organization proper that we're going to take a look into detail. So today we will not actually look at tactics. Obviously we will make some sort of broader both strategical and tactical assessment about the data that we know about the Burgundian army of this period, but fundamentally sticking to the organizational side of the story. And eventually we will make another video dedicated instead to tactics proper. Right, and there is a lot to say about that, because eventually these things are better explained more than, in a broader spectrum, actually studying the single battles. And I promise, of course, I will make a video for each of the major battles, especially the Swiss wars, as you know. And that's where the story gets fascinating, because from one side we don't know really much about the armies of this time. At the same time we know relatively much about this specific one compared to the others. So there is some missing evidence that we need to try to decipher on the basis of some sort of military logic, and from the other we have sound data that can help us in the process. So first of all, and I reminded this when I was making that last video about Burgundian so-called uniforms, let's say, as you know, the Burgundian army at this point is a model of, let's say, of political centralization. I mean, it emanates from the degree of the structuring of the Burgundian state properly. At the end of the Middle Ages, this very composite state, telling the truth. Burgundy is nothing but a chunk of it, that surely the most important individually speaking, but still the Dukes of Burgundy, the Valois Burgundy house has managed to expand across, but fundamentally between France and the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore also in part in the Netherlands, in the lowlands more properly, mostly the Flemish area. And as you know, this will have very important consequences, especially for modern Europe, the Burgundian legacy of the Habsburgs, etc. But for now, we stick to this phase. So it's in many ways a transitional army from the, would say, the typical medieval ones to kind of sort of proto-modern ones, and yet it's history of a failure at the end of the day, because this very sophisticated military system, apparently sophisticated, surely very, very complex, etc., and developed with a sense of of tactical development behind that it is reflecting this very accelerated progress that is happening in medieval warfare at the end. In fact, the thresholds actually of the modern age fails clamorously, with this series of continuous repeated defeats especially against the Swiss, but also on other fronts things didn't go excessively well. So it's one of those great question marks that you can wonder at this point. I'm sure I will create a playlist dedicated to the Burgundian army as a whole, but for now you can find these topics in part already discussed if you go into the medieval France playlist. So for any question that you may find still answered there, just take those as a reference. So and a very important thing to remember about the Burgundian army, that it fundamentally stems from a properly French mold, right? In terms of military organization, it really owes much to the military developments of the Kingdom of France during the 14th and the 15th century. The same Ordinance, so the Ordinance that basically become the defining name actually of the army, or at least of the bulk of this sort of semi-permanent at this point, and professional army of Charles the Bold is in fact following in part the precedent that had been set by the French King Charles VII in his Ordinance of 1445. And the eventual reforms of this army in the late 15th century were in fact still similar. They went along the same lines of the French military, and yet they also add something new about this. So there is also this key figure of the story, this Charles the Bold, that is considered in fact in this very multi-dimensional way, because he's been the great reformer of the Burgundian army in this phase, and ruling from 1467 to 1477. This key figure that really invested a lot of these domains, etc., into the construction of this military system. By the way, I just remembered that part of the military developments of France and Burgundy are going relatively in parallel. For example, Burgundy sometimes for certain things was more advanced. For example, Burgundy was particularly on the lead, at least in Central Europe, for the development of artillery parks. That is something that actually developed before the French crown, and that in that sense the French crown kind of starts more imitating that side. The reasons here are different. The French kingdom as a whole was kind of a mostly feudal system, while Burgundy could have access also to this very intensely communal and military systems coming from the cities of the Flanders, that provided also with a lot of technological know-how, and this improvements in artillery at this time is starting to become a must, even properly on the battlefield, right? In order to to prevail against the enemy. Still, artillery is obviously mostly about siege warfare, but technology is evolving fairly fast, and what we see in fact in these armies is that there is no real watershed, at least in terms of the several of the various tactical arms employed in these armies between the Middle Ages and the modern age of Renaissance warfare. The watersheds are posed mostly by certain models of military organization from an administrative point of view, rather than a specific tactical formula that, however, evolves and perfectionates over this time, and definitely at the time of, at least before the Spanish Tercio, at least, it was extremely still yet to be fully defined. And a lot had changed in medieval warfare at this point. And we will observe now, especially the rise of these thickly packed formations of professionally trained pikemen that are to really change substantially the battlefields of Europe in their essentials, remaining really at the center of the story. But still, that is not fully developed, right? There is lots of elements that, in this sense, can make you look at Burgundian army from a still relatively, traditional army from one side, and some newer elements from the other. But part also of the explanation why the system failed at the end is probably because it's also difficult to understand, because we don't know much of what concretely happened on the field, or even the tactical interaction or organizations, but that this model had not been homogenized, so that it had some elements of, let's say, of innovation, but they still had to be fully developed in their full potential and to be rationalized in one sense. And this does not really depend on on a magic alchemy that derives from what the guy at the top is thinking as a reformer, etc. It's really a problem of political and social background. You don't come to change these armies if there hasn't been a previous development that helps you doing that. And probably Charles the Bold, that therefore emerges like one of the great defeated figures of the period. He dies eventually on the battlefield in his last military disaster, of course. Is we don't really know what was in his mind. That sometimes we need to adopt these narratives like, there is this total debacle and this massive repeated defeats, and especially in cases like this, you can't start legitimately to say there was something wrong somewhere, right? It probably has to do naturally with this military model that we actually never discussed on Schwerpunkt yet. So that's one thing. There is also bad luck, and there is also maybe some lack of commitment of this army that was prevalently also still a half mercenary and feudal ones, sort of like that were here. It's kind of even. We'll look at the details better now, but whatever it went, it was a failure, and these repeated defeats are not something you can explain simply by saying, well, these guys were unlucky. But we're still talking about a very complex military system about which ultimately we don't know much, and this is really for all like the ancient world, medieval world, but also for large parts even of modern age and even contemporary era, something unknown. We don't know much of what happens on the battlefield, and what happens on a battlefield and also outside of it. It's so dramatically overcomplicated, and we know so incredibly few that making a definitive assessment it doesn't quite even make sense. Methodologically speaking, you should stay to what we have, hope that something else will come out, because this is still maybe possible in part, but at the end of the day we have this evidence we have to rely on, and that's pretty much it. So the third decision to raise a permanent army at this point in Charles the Bold's Burgundy seemingly happened in 1469, right? And we also in here we don't have a full certainty about the composition of the army, but basically here the paper strength would be 1,200 5-man lances as a basic organization, and according to an Italian prince, on the model of the French Compagnie de l'Ordinance, and to a lesser extent the mercenary companies of Venice, right? These models here are particularly important because at the time, the French army and the Italian condotta system were the most advanced military models around. They were the most modern, the ones that definitely were heading towards a greater professionalization, that had also the best know-how, technological development. And it's obvious that in such a widely interconnected European military system at this point, these models would be looked upon. Especially the Venetian condotta was a thing really to be looked upon with respect, and also the French crown was just so developing, so pretty close to Burgundy, what was eventually already part of the same Burgundian military from the originary. But this paper strength is always to be confronted with what was actually raised, right? And it's the eventually doesn't seem nor these 1,200 5-man lances, nor also the proposed 1,000 lances of the Ordinance seem to have been mustered at the end of 1470, right? And so this is interesting because there is a lot of disposition here. If you look at that video I made on the battle formations of the Burgundian army, you see that fundamentally there was a lot of theoretical thinking about what these armies should be about, all the various battle plans. We're lucky to have this stuff having survived, but we actually know that in partly were largely theoretical in many ways, and it's eventually the reality on the battlefield changed. Yet that shows also that behind this proposals there was an actual idea of feasibility that, as we see now, will get enhanced and turned into practice with, the idea that this was a complex system. That's what they had pretty clearly in their mind. Probably what was deployed on the battlefield was, especially in terms of tactical interaction, probably way simpler than what these models, theoretical models, were really about. From the Ordinance of July 1471, there is this following through to the proposals, and it basically we take a look to the resulting reorganization of the ordinances. So, according to the July 1471 ordinance, there had to be 1,250 lances. So, although probably this was also like the original one, 1,200, it's possible that there was or quite likely this was a mistake about this, but whatever, it's not a big difference. Which simply for some analogies with later armies that were raised by Charles, because this was always about this to as a basic strength about the 12 ordnance companies of 100 lances. Even later, when this thing, so some of the most intense commitment during the Swiss campaigns of 1476, 1477. There's also to say that we have some linguistical problem to understand, because most Burgundian troops, aside from being part of the ordinance or not, are described as part of the ordinance, right? And there were definitely certain changes in the organic, for example. For example, during the Siege of Neuss in 1474, 1475, it was this massive, in terms of logistical resources and organization, siege of Neuss in Germany that was done initially with the idea of contending the imperial crown to the Habsburgs, and eventually resulted in a famous marriage that will bring the Habsburgs eventually, in fact, to inherit the Burgundian Netherlands, where you see that basically the companies of the ordinance were increased from 12 to 20, so right, it's a big number, and this is partly because sieges were normally carried out by needed these very large numbers of men, especially of infantry, right? Because you have to literally surround the place, you have to remain there, ensuring that the enemy doesn't manage to force the block, to resupply the fortress, etc. So this we can't clearly look through these things, but the actual numbers and organization. But we suspect that within the ordinance there were also lots of other troops, as always, that were, if not at their side, but at least in the probably at their side, but chiefly always siding with the ordinances, as we will see later on a regular basis, because there were not just the ordinances; those were only a part of it. Then there were the feudal contingents, the allies, etc. These were very, very composite armies by default. Here we're talking about medieval armies. In this sense, it was a sort of collection of all the various mercenary companies and feudal contingents and town militias, and everybody had a background in this sense. Even the same mercenaries, there was no homogeneity in there. There were many noblemen, many people, all the most complicated political and military connections in this field. But it's partly this that at a certain point into medieval, I mean, at the end of Middle Ages, brings to the effort to homogenize all this and to try to make it work as one, something at least that was partly more manageable, because more uniform in some very primitive fashion, right? And in these ordinances of 1471, what you see is also a differentiation in the composition of the, let's say, or better, a change in the composition of the ranks previously. So the ranks, by standard, up to that point in the Burgundian army, had comprised just the men-at-arms. That was the heavy cavalry guy. You know, the heavy knight mounted with this massive, even, you know, a lot of armor. Also here, armor was issued in several, you know, different levels. Usually, you know, the full plate armor is something that develops for horses even at this point, but it remains something very, very rare. I think it was issued just about frontal plate or something like that, but probably there was also in here a greater segmentation of some kind. Then the couturier. The couturier would be substantially it's light cavalry. It's probably about, they were javeliners. However, they could be really flexible in many ways. They could work partly even as heavy kind of medium cavalry or skirmish cavalry. Probably they were also more flexible in a sense. And then the page, that was field aid basically, but also in here it was probably evolving towards something more active on the battlefield, right? And well, so this was actually what you see in the ranks as a tactical unit is something very old. It's something you start finding since the 14th century, and conceptually even before in practice. This emerged from the original idea of the knight that had to have one squire, and eventually other, you know, spare horses, and maybe some other squires that could mount them and assist the knight. So these are complicated topics that we will have to maybe deepen on another occasion. But I partly discussed this, like I made some video about the development of 13th century organic units into the 40s. There is something about that. But the important is that up to 1471, the Burgundian ranks was essentially composed of what we've just listed, and it was additioned. It was added to it other 3 men, because basically, together with the men-at-arms, with the couturier and the page, there were 3 mounted archers, right? And this is particularly important. There is a lot of attention given to these mounted archers because they're properly mounted archers. They're not horse archers yet, and it seems that their equipment, in fact, was on certain occasions, but I have to look more in detail to this, was even it comprised even something like a double-hand sword, and so that's not exactly like just light skirmish cavalry, right? But still, this tells you about the development of this very tactically dynamic units that basically are meant to support at that point the what conceptually was still the ranks, right? But that from a tactical point of view, it was flanked now, but joined by these 3 other mounted archers of support that they could have very, very variable role on the field. And this is naturally a product of professionalization, you know, and of people who spent their life in this service, and were able to fight a bit in all the ways. So they were very resourceful. They probably were veterans. But later we will see how these armies were practically, I mean, from which pool at least of men were actually raised. So looking back to the men-at-arms, you have that it normally had something like 3 horses for his own this relatively small retinue that was with him, including at least 1 war horse, right? So and we're talking naturally about what still pertained to the original ranks, right? Obviously, the mounted archers had their own horses as well. Just think about the logistical cost. So basically, here we have at least 6 horses in this ranks plus 3 mounted archers, right? And at least one of these horses was to be the war horse, so the one sufficient to charge and break lances, right? So it was really the heavy shock cavalry that made still basically the make up the bulk, at least of the strengths of the average medieval army at this time. Doesn't matter that pikes had started, orderly squares of pikemen were starting to appear in the field. Naturally, we will see that basically that's what the Burgundians lost to against the Swiss. But this tells you, in fact, about the very progressive development that was happening in medieval warfare as a whole, right? But it was normal to have the heavier cavalry that had to have definitely a determinant, but often also decisive role into engagements. That, however, now needed apparently several more tactical supports than just this uniquely, leaning. And because society was changing, it was not just a matter of feudalism was partly declining in front, even on the rise of the more centralized state, of these permanent forces, also of commoners, etc. They were framed into as professionals in armies. Still very different from the average, though, because still, especially the larger numbers here, were still provided in these armies by unprofessional militias, right? And naturally, the one war horse was ridden by the man at arms himself, right, and the courtier and the page taking the lesser mounts, right. This is particularly important because probably there were more horses even. This is what I think, at least, is that especially when you look at how conceptually the lanks developed, like you realize that this, for example, it's important to understand that these were minimum issued equipment, like the horses, theoretically, because these were largely still private guys that were enlisted in the ordinances, but could naturally provide with their own means other equipment, right? And technically, tactical units like the lanks had emerged from, in fact, this knight that fought usually on more than one horse for himself, not necessarily the big war horse, the one that had really to break lanks, as it says here in the ordinance, but he had to mount others, and during battles, really, you don't always need the war horse. Actually, even during the pike of, let's say, the peak of feudalism, the were most of knights actually didn't actually ride destrée, right? They use something like runners, etc. And the squires using the round scenes most of the times, because the ultra heavy cavalry is something you keep aside, usually in reserve, while other types of troops fight, but still mounted men at arms fundamentally. So also in here, what was issued is it was at least to have that heavy war horse that produced in part that determinant tactical component that the man at arms and his mount represented. Were still at the base of medieval warfare. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. So there was even an addition. In addition to these 6 mounted men, other 3 footmen per lanks, right? So here you have 3 plus 3 plus 3. So we have 9 in one lanks. Men at arms, courtier, the page, 3 mounted archers, and 3 footmen. That comprised, the last ones, a crossbowman, a culvernier, that is a hand gunner, and a pikeman. Now, this is also particularly important because if you look at the maps and you try to represent this on the field, basically you have a pretty dynamic army, conceptually speaking, right? Of 9 men, just 1 is a pikeman, for example. And we will see now, eventually, actually, that the numbers of the field, in fact, of these theoretical ordinances were quite different. The ratios were quite different, but still, it's the concept that matters in here. Here you have a solid mounted power that is supported by missile power with 3 mounted archers, a crossbowman, a culverinier. Right now, handguns were developing relatively fast since the very last decades of the 14th century. They had started to become a significant tactical variable on the field. And then you have this pikeman that is really a few, and this probably there is something hidden behind this, because that is revealed in part by the actual numbers, where pikemen were more actually on the field than what this ordinance issued, for reasons that we'll try to explain now. But it tells you at least that conceptually this wasn't still so important, at least in Burgundian army, right? That kind of makes sense in certain particular contexts. I mean, the Burgundians were incidentally, as we said before, the ones who would meet the Swiss, that by the mid-15th century now had started producing these squares of trained pikemen that were, for the first time in medieval history, capable of actually advancing without breaking, with a very aggressive mindset, etc. So something that really changes, that makes really transition at that point, medieval warfare to a Renaissance one, because everybody imitates the Swiss and so on. So, but you see that in here, theoretically, the pikeman is not so fundamental, at least in principle. Remember that Burgundy is very, very chivalric in mindset, right? The Dukes of Burgundy are the great knights, the great champions of Christianity. They are the ones who lead crusades against the Ottomans in the Balkans. That there is this general consensus. Think about the Golden Fleece, this very extremely prestigious order, that the Burgundians were kind of the best knights around, right? So these guys were soaked into aristocratic ethos. So even this spread of other foot troops, etc., was something that didn't quite belong to that particularly mostly French-oriented military culture, right? In France, basically, that was the greatest weakness at the end of the day, the lack of a consistent infantry that instead starts spreading eventually among the Swiss, among the Spanish, but it's still far from becoming widespread at this point and imitated by. In case of the French, it will be a failure. Actually, Francis I, beginning of 16th century, tried that, creating this pikemen. They were no better than militia. They were actually disbanded, and they kept hiring the Swiss mercenaries at that point for making their own infantry. But Burgundy at that point doesn't exist anymore. So looking at the broader organization, so now that we have defined the ranks, basically there were the ordinance comprehended 12 companies, each one made up of 100 lances. So the maths here is clear. It's technically 900 men per 12, right? And this is pretty, it's not enormous, an enormous amount of troops, but it starts being a pretty imposing thing on paper. Remember that. And the companies were commanded, each one by a conducteur, and eventually were subdivided on a decimal base into units of 10 men-at-arms. So 10 lances basically. So the men-at-arms with all is the retinue of other 8 people, and each one of these units of 10 men-at-arms was commanded by the désigné. So each of these tents in turn were further subdivided into these other units, these other 2 units known as chambre, one of 6 men-at-arms led by désigné, and the other 4 led by a chef de chambre, that was the désigné lieutenant. This is interesting because it basically shows that within the company of 100 lances there were these subunits, 10 subunits, and each one of them seems to have it was divided with a solid bulk of a ratio 3 to 2 basically, and with these two officers basically that were the higher one in command of the three of this 3/5, let's say, and the other subordinate in command of 2/5. Now this is interesting because given this amount of troops, you understand that this subunit, this chambre, were very tactically dynamic, and they were evidently conceived on the field to be autonomous and to be doing most of the actual combat, and basically and probably there was within it a sort of social a sort of certification, in the sense that probably the chef the désigné was at the head of this more aggressive, more even stronger, naturally, not just numerically speaking, but probably also in terms of equipment, eventually supported by this other by the unit of the chef de chambre, that had to support them in some ways. So it's quite interesting, because that was the segmentation. It's normal one. Say that there is the company, and there's these subunits that have to do the work on the field, supporting each other during the process. Right. Remember that here still battles are fundamentally still a few about maneuvering. I mean, maneuvering is definitely increasing pretty fast, but the average concept is that there has to be this mutual, back and forth within the between the two armies, still kind of wearing them out, each other out, and going on with this attrition and attempting this broader coordination with some tactical more or less bold tactical maneuver that, however, didn't quite work excessively well. The Swiss now are going to master this thing, but still in a fairly simple way, right? Mostly centering the effectiveness on this simplicity, right? The Swiss army is essentially a mono-arm army. It's all about pikemen. Yes, there are a bunch of gunners, crossbowmen, even some artillery, but they're virtually irrelevant. Even though the importance of missile, firepower here is increasing, but you understand the Burgundian army here, the way it's conceived, it's a multi-arm army, and yet all this complexity doesn't bring to a particular tactical effectiveness, a dynamism that effectively reaches a concrete achievement on the field, right? And there is a very important element here, is that about the unit of command, the idea that the more you subdivide the army, the more it's difficult to control it. So the Swiss, in this sense, are much more faster and efficient, because after all, they're very simple. That they only have those usually up to 3 blocks that they use, but most of the times all together, actually, not even in the echelon formation that goes progressively. That happened like only once, and people think that was the standard tactics of this way. It wasn't really like that. It was much more simpler, and yet it turned out to be incredibly effective against the system. So this great subdivision, even the organic, all these tactical elements blended together, at the end of the day, might have created more complexity than actual control, and therefore a not so good results at the end of the day. Not that these armies didn't work. Erase from your mind that these developments, first of all, as I said at the beginning, we don't know enough about them, right? We don't actually know what happened on the field. We don't know how they actually fought. We can guess something about that, but never think that these were kind of incapable armies that were weird, or that there was this guy at the top that decided at one point to reform them and was kind of wrong, right? This was still kind of the most sophisticated and effective armies out there, and the Burgundian ordinances were were feared legitimately for their advancement, their development. They had some of the finest tactical elements of the time, picked from the best of Europe in terms of men of technology. So we will say it later, and still they were extremely had a terrific offensive capability for the standards of the time. But at the same time, this is the point I would like to stress: they weren't radically different, right? They still worked in the way more or less medieval armies had fairly always worked. Now the real difference is made by the fact that they are becoming something professional at the end of the day. That they are made up of people who do this as a living, and that know how to make this complex machine to develop and to make kept it oiled and effective and efficient, right? So looking at the mounted, when you look at this distinction that we have made now, we said we'd talk about the lances and the varios, and the retinues. But here you have to think that basically the lance proper, that is the 3-man unit, right, is detached. That is to say that basically this cavalry unit with the heavy cavalrymen and the couturier at his follower, like a lighter cavalryman, and the page were fighting in the battle line detached from the rest of the units, right, of the lances, now how they were called in their entirety of 9 men. So the mounted archer and infantry were deployed, arrayed in another position, always, close enough to be of support, at least theoretically, but still having this obvious, and naturally having this obvious interaction sake for supporting the men at arms, and is to attendants basically, and were put all together in this company unit, right? That is that basically this 100 lances organic was put all together in companies, in the company. The 100 lances made up the company, right? So these guys, mounted archers and footmen, were detached within the same company from the men at arms and the other 2 guys, and fighting in another position, let's say. And in fact, they had another officer commanding them. They were all commanded together as a company by the capitaine, with a porte enseigne and a guidon, right? So this is important because it tells you that there was a captain at the head of the company, commanding both the mounted archers and these footmen that we see were prevalently missile troops. Each one of these captain has a standard bearer and another main lesser NCOs. So they are in charge of what is happening there, and they function separately from the man at arms and his 2 guys, right? Because these 2 types of units function in a substantially different way. Like the 3 men of the original lance, let's say, were all about cavalry charges, coming back and regrouping and launching new charge, and so on and on and on and on and on. These other guys in the rear, most of the times, had to basically support them with missile power, but they have to work in a different way from what the heavy cavalry is doing, because that is busy on its own, right? So these guys have an evidently support role in the process. So there are these, and this is also interesting, is that the various different troop types within the mounted archers and infantry fight in separate units in turn. They are under centenie, and So this is basically a company of 100 under a centenier. That is in turn divided into 3 trenteniers. Trenteniers, commanded by the trentenier, right? So what you have here is that within that larger group of 600, between basically 300 mounted archers and 300 crossbowmen and handgunners and pikemen, each one fights within its own type of tactical specialty, right? And it's interesting because you see that they're divided by 100, right? So this means that every pikeman fought into this centenier, for example, that was made all by pikemen. Then there was another one made all by handgunners, another all by crossbowmen, right? And the same goes for the and actually I think the mounted archers were all into one. No, well, actually they were detached properly because they were also divided into these 3 companies of 100, each one under their own commanders. And this is particularly interesting because you realize that in turn they were divided into these companies of 100 were divided into 3 subunits. So you have basically, these were probably made of 33 men, right? So that's where you have the 30s in here. And it's a very, very subdivided system, right? So to really make it clearer, you have 12 companies of 100 lances each. Each one of these companies is in turn made up of other companies, 12 companies of 100 lances, of which in turn, within which in turn the cavalry, that is 300 cavalrymen subdivided between men-at-arms, couturier and page are fighting kind of alone, and then these other 600 men are fighting within other sub-companies of 100 each, subdivided in on the base, divided on the base of tactical specialty of 6 different units that are in turn subdivided into 3 units each. So it's a very complicated system, right? And you can, it's not overly complicated considering what organics is really about, but it's still, and you understand this, it really has a lot of faith fundamentally in the tactical cooperation of all these elements. And it's not, as we were saying before, it's remarkable in a sense that probably there was some sophisticated thought that this could work at the base, and probably was even well conceived, but it increased dramatically also the confusion in particularly dramatic situations, right? And as it could happen in any other army, but at this point also having a particular type of tactical specialization that was unknown to repartition, let's say, that was unknown to other armies, right? So this presence of mounted archers and pikemen, handgunners, crossbowmen, men-at-arms is nothing strange. All armies at the time have these things, but these are very, very specifically, these ratios are very specific of the Burgundian army, and they have to respond to a certain tactical idea of how this has to work. Naturally, we have always to distinguish, first of all, the theoretical, what is on paper and what is in reality, but also you should ask yourself, were these repartitions fundamentally administrative, or did they have also some, the subdivisions were conceived even for some tactical function, which seems to have been the case, right? These numbers seem not to have been casual. There is a general logic about this. You have the bulk of heavy cavalry in the front, theoretically, the most important element. that makes like the hammer smashes continuously against enemy lines, charge after charge, regrouping after regrouping. And then on the back you have this pretty substantial missile power of mounted archers that are very dynamic and lay in the middle, and in this sense they represent even a sort of very sound connection between the heavy cavalry and the foot missile troops. And one of the reasons is evidently that this had also to screen partly this very strong foot missile power that was pretty heavy but pretty vulnerable, for example, to enemy heavier cavalry. So the idea is that there was probably some very progressive effort conceived into this to wear out the enemy the more it advanced, right? And then this pikemen that have this stopping point that has this obvious reason and function on the battlefield, but it is basically at the end of the line. This is also kind of typical because the infantry had at this point, aside from the Swiss, had not made in the 15th century such. I mean, it was important, but it didn't represent quite of a big deal at the end of the day. It, the great victories of medieval infantry are in the first half of the 14th century, renowningly. Then, basically, they tend to decline. There's a sort of refeudalization from which infantry never goes away, but it also is not able to reach these massive victories, aside from the usual exception that, however, confirms the rule of the English armies that were something particularly unique in that frame and that have to be understood, in fact, and treated didactically as something very different from the other commoners' armies of the beginning of the 14th century that remain as a model until the end of the Middle Ages, even partly beyond. Well, but by the 16th century has become, at least by the mid-16th century, has become evidently kind of anachronistic. But it does make sense. These are not random numbers, random dispositions. That's why I'm telling you this system probably worked, and it wasn't really put there just ideally, right? Then paper strength and real strength is another issue, but there is no single army that has the same exact number of men in history ever. There is no standardization for real in any case. Even if you had it at the beginning of the campaign, then these armies get worn out and the numbers decline. But it's also interesting to see in which measure. And now let's pass to the actual strength, because we have this for an ordinance of 1472, right, that was issued at the end of the year's campaign against France, that lists let's say the theoretical strength, but we also know about the actual one that it was at the time. That is particularly meaningful, right? So we have a let's say an actual strength. Now we'll read what the theoretical strength would be, and looking at the actual one. Now, and passing now at the difference between theoretical and actual strength. Here we see an ordinance of 1472 that was issued at the end of the year's campaign against France, in which there is fundamentally the total of the troops is the same, but basically the ratios are altered. So now I will read you the theoretical one first and the actual one second. So theoretical strength is 1,200 men-at-arms, 3,600 crossbowmen, 1,200 infantry archers, 1,200 pikemen, and 1,200 culverniers. Right. So here the total is 8,400. The actual strength measured during the campaign is actually of 1,200 men-at-arms. So it's the same for the men-at-arms. Then 3,600 between mounted archers and crossbowmen, with a ratio of 3,000 mounted archers and 600 crossbowmen. And 1,000 infantry archers, so slightly less, 200 less than the theoretical strength. 2,000 pikemen, so almost double number of pikemen, and 600 culverniers, so basically a half than the theoretical strength. Also in here, as I was saying before, the total is 8,400. So this is particularly interesting. So what you see, as we've just said, is that the men-at-arms number remains the same. So basically you have this solid bulk of heavy cavalry that remains unvaried, and that doesn't seems, and this tells a lot, because basically this was probably the most important part of the army, and therefore it's paradoxically the one that changes the least, because it's the one you count on the most, generally speaking, right? So it tends to vary less. Then you actually have the distinction I made before between the 3,600. Actually, here 3,600 is the theoretical strength of missile troops between mounted archers and crossbowmen proper. So here the proportion is remained, but you realize that the crossbowmen are a substantial number. Okay, they're 1/5 of the mounted archers, right? So the mounted archers have quite greater importance than crossbowmen themselves. So crossbowmen are on foot, right? And this is interesting because it tells you that according to this, in terms of tactical flexibility, mounted archers are better, something you want to invest more in than crossbowmen, also because they represent this extremely effective scouting force that you can employ in the most diverse tactical scenarios, both on the field but also for as explorers, basically, and as the vanguard of the army, having this dramatic effectiveness. Remember that these are mounted archers. That is, in theory, they wouldn't be cavalry. They have horses, but they can dismount and fight on foot as well. This is something you find in renownedly, for example, in the English armies, the 100 Years' War, the same concept. All those longbowmen weren't just for pitched battles that where they dismounted to stay there with the men at arms and repelling cavalry charges. They also were employed in this, during the chevauchée, in this, very dynamic tactical scenarios of raiding, pillaging, skirmishing, screening, harassing the enemy, etc. That is something that actually makes up for the majority of military operations during a campaign. Now, talking about the infantry, now here things get fairly cool, because basically, as the previous ordinances, you have this theoretical strength that in which infantry, archers, pikemen, culverniers should always be at the same in the same number, 1,200, right? Here you have a drop in infantry archers that decrease fundamentally of 1/6, right? And of especially a halvening of the culverniers and an almost doubling of the pikemen. So at the end of the day, you have 1,000 infantry archers, 600 culverniers, and 2,000 pikemen. And this means that on foot, you have a solid bulk of infantry, of pike infantry, essentially. So something that really is meant for stopping power, primarily at least. Here, the pikemen, I think that they weren't really so. They were very different in terms of tactical performance from the Swiss ones, because the Swiss have much larger numbers of pikemen, and they count on that mass, but also on that training to achieve particular things on the battlefield. Here, 2,000 pikemen is not really a lot. Like pikemen, this is very important about pikemen. If they're gonna have, especially also an aggressive role, they have to be, but also in a defensive role, actually, they have to be many, right? If we want them to be aggressive, they have to be very intensely trained. That also costs a lot, and that's what was Swiss infantry was basically about. 2,000, yeah, okay, it's still in the range of thousands, so it's not a few men, but probably they're not excessively consistent. I mean, 2 pikemen is not compared to the numbers also of other of the total strength. I mean, you have here 8,400 total of the troops, and basically the pikemen do not make it up for even 1/4 of the whole strength. So really, they do not represent this massive stopping power overall in the army. I mean, if you rout, just even a half of the rest of the troops, it's not that these guys can hold the ground so easily. Right? They can't make this last stand. We've seen that in the organic repetition. They had probably this role. I mean, being deployed, functioning as this ultimate line, because that's what medieval infantry usually does, right? And naturally, things could get very more complicated. In Battle of Formation video we made about the Burgundian army, and there is showed something particularly complex, way more complex, several layers of lines, so it's not that simple. But in that video we were pointing out, in fact, that those dispositions, as we said before now, were highly theoretical, and probably on the field things worked in a slightly different way that probably, I believe, tended to be simpler and fairly more traditional and intuitive, because over differentiating, over specializing, subdividing excessively, it's not that it's going to give you that strength, that core, right? Or even the flexibility is not reached simply by splitting the units and mixing them, etc. It has to have a sense, and what can happen on the battlefield should usually structures tactical formations in a way that they can react pretty, at their best of flexibility, but at the same time still providing this solid bulk of elements that are also fairly easy to command from the top, right? So this is meaningful in my opinion, and however, there is a further consideration in general, that is that this pikemen in the actual strength, they're not surprisingly doubled, because that was an element that, albeit not fully developed in the Burgundian army as, let's say, the Swiss one, that was simply a step ahead compared to all the other European infantries of the time, was still in development and served to something. I mean, that was in perspective. Now we know the future, right? You needed that stopping power. Cavalry was dramatically heavy, and firepower was substantial now. So you needed this solid bulk of men, right? And that 1/3 of all the infantry, just to frame the pikemen just in one of these sections, is not fully functional to what pikemen should serve to. It's also interesting that Calverniers are the ones that seemingly in the actual strengths have suffered the most from the theoretical compared to the theoretical one, because probably at this time the handgunners weren't still so dramatically important, especially because Renaissance warfare would evolve towards a model that was combining now huge blocks of pikemen, very differently from this composition, supported by handgunners, arquebusiers that were in that synergic form. Here you see the Calverniers basically make up for just there is a total practically of this 8,400 soldiers of basically 5,200 missile troops, of which only 600 are Calverniers. So this is still a phase in which objectively crossbow and bow, including longbow, which was used by the Burgundians because also there was plenty of Englishmen in their armies, we will see now, were more effective also in terms of rate of fire, of precision, etc. The cavalry was important, the handgun was important, but still not radically important, and especially in this composition. It was, philosophically not an essential part. Let's say here the philosophy, let's say, of this composition is very, very different. It focuses much on flexibility and firepower as a whole, and this solid mounted element that plays a major role with just a minor stopping power, for which the culverniers, even using them on the field implies that that they're usually less mobile troops, let's say, than archers, even infantry archers. Just they need, they have a heavier equipment. They need a certain particular deployment, because it's also risky to operate with gunpowder at a very close range, because things can, get lit up and everything exploding. It's complicated. So this is, for example, a good example in turn of how technology is still not everything in the process. All right. And at the same time, there is one thing to remember about this Ordinance of 1472, that we do not have the numbers of the pages and the couturiers. Here we have just the men-at-arms that are the ones, the canonical ones, 1200 that we have seen before. So theoretically, it means that together with the men-at-arms have to be at least other 2400 mounted troops of some kind, which is important, and here it's not counted. So it depletes even more the importance of pikemen and culverniers. So it kind of looks more like a French army than something radically different, or particularly more towards other forms of warfare, like they would now in a few decades, actually. And the reason why we don't have the number of mounted pages and couturiers is quite likely that because these were hired privately by the men-at-arms, hired and paid privately. So here the ordinance was not counting them, because the men-at-arms were normally providing this retinue by themselves. Remember that they were paid troops, but they were in part still kind of noblemen of the Valois Burgundy dominion. So these are not like detached, men-at-arms, drawn from the commonalty, equipped by the state. No, these are still the bulk of heavier nobility now engaged within the system. They're still basically operating like the fealty would do on a regular base. So by 1473 there is a further reorganization in which each company of men-at-arms is divided into 4 squadrons, known as cadre or escouade, of 25 lances, right? So basically, at least here we're said that the men-at-arms is split in turn into these 4 groups, right? And each of these 25 lances comprise 5 chambres and 5 lances. So here basically you have that besides the men-at-arms and the page de couturier, the rest of the troops are organized now in a more equal repartition between the units that attack and the one that are in support that we described before. And it seems that this became kind of equal. It's interesting because it may mean, but these are just hypotheses, I'm just reasoning by myself, that on the field they saw that this prevalence between the chambre and the lances was not over the lances. Was probably not so functional. It wasn't already a great difference, as we saying before. It was 3/5 versus 2/5. Now it's equal, right? It's 1 to 1. So probably this speaks in part for the theoretical nature of those numbers, for which on the field it was better to have equivalent units that alternated themselves on the field during the combat, right, in an equal fashion, so that this interior certification was seemingly useless. Maybe it corresponded, by the way, not even to a strictly operational functionality, but maybe just to a sort because of ranks, etc. So this gets leveled down, and it's probably and possibly, implausibly, I would say, fruit of practice, right? Of what seemingly had worked before, but it's just an hypothesis, right? And it was corrected in this years of war, and so of this chambre, one was commanded by the chef de cadre, and the other 4 by the chef de chambre. This is also interesting. So you have a further subdivision for which of this force of the company. One is guided by the superior command officer, let's say, and the other 4 by inferior officers. So this also speaks probably for this sake of better control, this hierarchization, for which there is a central unit that commands the other 4 and kind of supervises them, and it's not just simply paritary, but is above level. And it probably has to do also with this cavalry, let's say, flexibility, this ability of launching several units, but where you see the enemy line with some gaps, etc. So having more shots at disposal, obviously reducing in this sense the unit of let's say the size of the unit under command, but still being surgically effective into the enemy line. And these are heavy cavalry, right? So that's what they should do best, and renowningly takes relatively few to be effective. If you launch even a few men under a disorganized formation or a gap, right? It takes really a few. So it's important to be able to commit all these elements separately, so that you always have some sort of reserve that you can throw in at the right moment. And interestingly enough, 3 of each company chef de cadre were appointed by the conducteur, while the 4th was appointed by the Duke himself, as he was the conducteur himself. So it's as the conducteur was appointed, by the Duke. And so as in France, so talking about the composition bit of these armies, now that we stopped the strictly organizational phase, but where did these troops come from exactly? So just like in France, the troops that made up the Ordinance, right, were primarily employed mercenaries, right? There were definitely certain noblemen that had prestigious places, offices within the army, and that had this kind of prestigious position, right? They were paid, they received their own good compensation for it, but still these were fundamentally mercenaries. And from the 14th century, actually, most of the troops that you find on the field are, especially of the strictly fighting force, aside from the militias that are just summoned in case of emergency most of the times, are actually mercenaries. What does this exactly mean? Well, it means basically that the feudal system has come itself apart, in at least in the recruitmental dynamics, and the same noblemen that made up the feudal elite now render their service in exchange for payment, right? This is something that really was had started far before, like even since the beginning. Let's say that with progressive monetization of European economy, there is the idea that this paradoxical idea that the vassal that is already being paid with properties that were the fief that entrusted by the duke, by the prince, the king, etc., has to be paid for military service. This was negotiated, was bargained. There is all a political balance in the process. And at this point, Europe is rising fast, and as we've seen, there are also other tactical elements that are needed, both for the technological development, but also for the simple sheer availability of these troops among the commoners that are now fairly wealthy, etc. So it's a much less aristocratic army than it was before, albeit it was still dominated, this is important to remember, by the aristocratic elite. And part of the monetization of the market of war also brings to these armies to be composed of people that come from the whole Europe, well, Western Europe at least, by large. Naturally, there were many Burgundians in the Burgundian ordinances, and this means, as we've seen before, because of the feudal collection of territories that the Valois Burgundy house had done. These were both French and German, but also those very very shaded other identities and and communities that existed between France and the Holy Roman Empire, like the Flemish were feeling kind of something on their own, like, etc. And it's interesting that the French usually made up the heavier cavalry on average, because these were lands that were probably much more intensely feudalized than others, or at least there was a higher, more developed feudal tradition in general. The fiefs were larger. These guys had partly, that France has a relatively limited development, for example, of commonalities of communes compared to, in fact, to Flanders or even certain areas of Germany. And so, because it's a way more intensely feudalized land. But lots of troops, and sometimes even the majority of them, came from other countries that were not under Burgundian dominance. Philippe de Comines, for example, tells us that Charles the Bold himself preferred foreigners to his own subjects. Now, this is interesting because it happens pretty frequently, actually, that this is naturally a complex idea. The general idea is that maybe the troops would join. Let's try to make a synthesis. The troops that join in here, that come from other countries, are eventually people who, are attracted by the wealth of Burgundy, and that come there as volunteers, fundamentally. So, and naturally, if you try to squeeze your subjects, because to make them participate to the ordinance, they eventually, you're enforcing that on them. So strangers are more likely to be there in Burgundy to be hired as troops. And the two prevalent nationalities of Burgundian armies actually were Italian and English. These were present literally en masse into Burgundian armies. Also in here there are differences. For example, the Italians were partly coming from Savoy. Savoy at this time has expanded into Piedmont. So Savoy proper is French in language and culture, but the bulk of Savoyard power comes from Piedmont. So these are the Italian communal areas that came from both from this French Savoy and from northern Italy. Interestingly enough, there were even Neapolitans in Burgundian army, right? There is this employment in great quantity, especially from after 1472, that sees, for example, the 3 years service of Troilo from Rossano with 150 lances, 100 mounted crossbowmen, and 200 infantry. Interestingly enough, then there are other figures. The Count of Campobasso, this very important figure eventually for the for the same fate of Burgundian dynasty, because he would betray actually Charles the Bold at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. So it causing effectively in part maybe this last great defeat. But the Count of Campobasso, who was Niccolo from Monteforte, was hired with 400 four-man lances, 400 mounted crossbowmen, and 300 infantry. Now, what you see in here, for example, is that Italian troops have 4-man lances, compared to the Burgundian ones that are traditionally 3-man lances, as we've seen. And this is usually a plus, because if you have, it's not really necessary, but usually, the larger the lance it is, and let's say, and the more the overall effectiveness of it should be, at least it means that a single lance is wealthier, is something that has more resources, has even better equipment, better horses, right? I'm not sure about whether this is probably the case, but it's obvious that it's better to have a 3-man lance than a 4-man lance than 3-man lance. Always, considering that you're paying them equally, right? And this elements that we see here of mounted crossbowmen from these Italian troops are important, because we haven't seen them elsewhere. Mounted crossbowmen were present a bit everywhere, but in this period you see that Burgundy seems to have, even partly France and definitely England, this thing chiefly for mounted archers, right? Instead, in areas like Germany, like Italy, they had something like crossbowmen more split. I really don't know why. I should look to this more in detail, but seemingly it was a thing. Let's say that France and England, Burgundy comprehended, were kind of developed in a bit of a similar fashion over time, especially during the 100 Years' War, which is kind of obvious for reasons of hybrid a little bit. And they are a bit of a system on their own. Like Spain, Germany, Italy are a bit different and have different traditions. Even though, generally speaking, the warfare is pretty homogeneous in Europe at this time. Another great name, like Bartolomeo Colleoni, it was this Captain General of Venice, this prominent condottiere, also signed with Charles the Bold a 3-year contract to serve with also a pretty large amount of troops, 1,000 men at arms and 1,500 infantry. But Venice, the Venetian Senate said, okay, basically impose him to remain where he was. But it's still interesting because you have such a big name in condottieri warfare that wants to fight in Burgundy. And also in here the composition is interesting. 1,000 men at arms, so cavalry, but also 1,500 infantry. And I don't think it's specified whether the internal composition, so I don't want to say that these were all pikemen. Obviously there was probably some missile troop as well. But you understand in this sense that Burgundy had a pretty wide net to catch into, right? Burgundy was, as we were saying before, was very wealthy, very powerful. Charles the Bold had constant contacts with England and Italy, not surprisingly. What do you think there were Italians and Englishmen in here? Well, it's partly because it was dramatically interested about whichever thing France was doing, both against England and in Italy. Because that equated, France was neighboring Burgundy, the main competitor after the end of the 100 Years' War, and at this looming threat on the House of Valois-Burgundy that effectively was the same House of Valois that reigned in France. It was just a branch of it, originally speaking. So it's a wide world market, and just think of what this means also in terms of sharing of knowledge, of military experience, of technology. It is important, and Burgundy has lots of money to finance this very best. Always Philippe de Comines reports that at the aforementioned siege of Neuss in 1474 in Germany, Charles the Bold army contained some thousand Italian men at arms, both good and bad. And here, good and bad is mentioned because these troops were under the command of the Count of Campobasso, that was considered this terrible, kind of traitor. Defined here a man of the most perfidious and dangerous character, right? And that deserted, in fact, with his 820 men just before the Battle of Nancy, right? Now, some thousand Italian men-at-arms. Now, we've seen that on average the Burgundian Ordinance was counted basically only 1,200 men-at-arms at the most. Here we have some thousand men-at-arms coming from another country. That's pretty massive. This also shows you what we were saying before, is that you can't considering the Ordinance as the whole military of Burgundy. And here you have a foreign element that is even more prevalent than the same ordinance. So you realize that the ordinance should be considered like sort of and relatively, actually it was a very large fort, but it's still kind of limited, considering especially the further modern development in fielding now a professional semi-permanent force in large numbers. In fact, the ordinance numbers are not excessively big, considering the potential of Burgundy in itself. If you look at the numbers, it's not really a few, and actually having fewer troops, it can even be better in terms of control. The larger the army is, and the general, the greater the nuisances are. So. But it's how much it drew from other military systems that is very, very interesting, fascinating. Richard Vaughan even states by 1476 that the Burgundian army could appropriately be described as predominantly Italian, right? And it's kind of self-evident by certain standards, because some of the senior officers of Burgundian army at this time were Rossano Campobasso, Jacques de Savoie, the Count of Romont, then James Galeotto, and for example at the Battle of Morat, Rossano alone commanded as many as 1,000 men. Right, so these Italians had quite a prestigious position to the Burgundian army, and they commanded large amounts of troops that partly they also raised on their own. Right. Passing to the English element on the Burgundian army, this is a long, love between the Burgundians and the English, as you know from the 100 Years' War. Like the English played within the factions internal to the French kingdom to split it, and effectively the Burgundians fight against their own Valois relatives, and they even march on Paris at one point, and the darkest hour French of the Valois during the 100 Years' War. And so the Burgundians had cooperated with the English for a very long time, also participated in the same armies, and they controlled large areas of France themselves. In 1411, for example, it was an English contingent of 800 men-at-arms and 2,000 archers that assisted John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, during his blockade of Paris. And the general, let's say the relations had not always been so easy between them, because the English at one point sided even with the Armagnac, that is the the loyalist faction of France against the Burgundians. So there had been this alliance switch during the process. Now the 100 Years' War is terribly complicated by certain standards. Never as the War of the Roses, I would say, but still pretty complicated. But after the assassination of Duke of Burgundy, John, in 1419, and this political gap that had formed there, the English side once again with Burgundy, because they feared that otherwise France would reunify very fast, and this alliance lasted for some 24 years and renewed later, especially when Edward IV of England married Edward IV's sister, Margaret of York, married the same Duke Charles. This alliance was revived, in fact, between 1467 and 1468. There are those same exact years, and it's interesting that there was probably a lot of mutual imitation. At least we know that Burgundians drew pretty heavily from the English types of troops. The majority of the English in service of Burgundy were mounted archers, and Philippe de Comines states, as it was widely known by the time, that the English were considered as the world's best with the bow, especially with the longbow, of course. That is kind of the same thing, but just bigger, right? As we all know. So you can find English troops, for example, in the Burgundian campaign against Liège in 1467 and 1468, so the same years of the marriage, and the royal marriage between England and Burgundy. And also 500 Englishmen are recorded at this siege of Saint-Trond. Edward IV of England sent in 1472 something between 2,000 or 3,000 archers to unite to Charles the Bold, some more the year after, and other 1,000 plus 13 men at arms in 1474. This composition is interesting because the English armies had been largely during the 100 Years' War that had finished, as you understand, 20 years before, characterized by this radical ratio between the number of men-at-arms and archers, longbowmen, right? The men-at-arms were very few compared to the longbowmen. Men-at-arms were usually something like, in the range of hundreds, the archers in the range of thousands, right? It was part of how the longbow tactic really worked. It was a matter of saturating, causing saturation for only just power, and that was all. It's a bit like the pikemen. You need large bodies of longbowmen to achieve that massive firepower that helped to bog down French cavalry charges, and then the men-at-arms would take care of them. And so, always at the siege of Neuss, where we saw there were so many Italians, we find, according to Philippe de Comines, also 3,000 fine English soldiers. This is the thing, and one ordnance company of the Burgundian army was commanded, in fact, by Sir John Middleton. So there were English commanders too in the Burgundian army. There is also this famous aborted expedition, English expedition into France in 1475. That was a kind of a very serious affair for France, because if Edward IV had invaded them, chances were, France was a pretty freaking risk. Even if the 100 Years' War was over, the English threat was something concrete. And similarly, on that occasion, the English had sent 2,000 archers to Charles the Bold in order to to cooperate to support him in this cooperation against the French king. And we have several evidence of English archers, especially fighting at major battles of the Burgundian Swiss wars, the Battle of Grandson, Morat, and Nancy, and the numbers varied, but this also has to do in part with during the specific battles, because naturally during the campaign these troops would be worn out by attrition, etc. But there was always this kind of English element. It's interesting. Charles the Bold was very appreciative of the English troops. He considered them as his friends and subjects, and they were probably really of good quality, because they were paid something like 1/4 more than the other archers, and this is kind of obvious, as England was, as we were saying before, was renowned for his archery, and definitely had specialized in this tactical element during the previous 200 years. So it was evidently the best pool where to recruit this kind of troops. And it's very interesting that part of English troops made up also part of the Burgundian ducal household, a bit like the in England the yeomen of the guard of the English king, right? And we have a rather detailed idea of what the ducal household was about, because we have a document from that describes it in May 1476 as composed by 8 squadrons, of which 4 were of the guard, so-called of the guard, and 4 of the court. And this had equal numbers, where they had roughly between 50 and 55 men-at-arms per each. And interestingly enough, it had even 4 companies by 100 mounted English archers per each. These were part of the guard. And in this document it says that theoretical strength was 404 men, including the centenier, but it was under strength of some 8 men. Then there were other English troops, additional ones, at least companies of mounted English archers, the ones we were observing before as main tactical specialty of the English and Burgundian armies, that were something similar in strength, 388 men. There was some other 4 other ordinary household infantry companies of 1 man each, so once again theoretically 400 men. Other 4 more such companies, this time described as extraordinary household infantry, so these were probably really the elite or something like that, and these were also less in numbers, something to 330. Then there was also another small detachment of something like between 40 men at arms that comprehended really the dukes, chamberlains, and gentlemen of the chamber, that were actually the ducal bodyguard, and they actually had the ducal banner in their control. So it was like some of the most highly prestigious, were very important men, and they were like the strongest picked body that had to defend physically the duke on the field. And then there are other attached units that are called extraordinary properly because they were they were not present by default. Like they could vary, right? And were not properly, in fact, framed within the guard units proper, right? Also, the numbers varied radically, and these were mostly about mounted archers. Yeah. So these were the same English ones, I believe, and you can imagine that, of course, the Duke would decide every time who he wanted to be followed with. So, as we were saying before, it was plenty of other troops that were called to participate to the Burgundian army aside from the Ordinance. We've seen the mercenaries, but naturally there were also other type of troops like the feudal contingents. This was known as the Army of Burgundy proper. Remember that Burgundy had this solid French tradition, so with all the local organizational feudal levy, let's say, organization of the troops. And there were actually, however, two different chunks of Burgundy. There was one in France proper, the other one was within the Holy Roman Empire. So here, on the composition of these feudal troops also we have, it's not excessively clear what these troops were about. I mean, some were properly vassals in the feudal hierarchy of Burgundy, others were actually non-vassals, but still, some veterans, men at arms. And some of them were actually veterans of the Ordinances, right, or the Ordinance companies. So they had been in the Burgundian army, in the regulars, let's say, if we can use this term, either as volunteers or draftees, because the Ordinances were also, they had this mixed recruitment system, which was mostly mercenaries, but also people who could be hired on occasion, right? And we don't know exactly how many troops Burgundy could master through the feudal levies. Some think something, couple, maybe up to 4,000 men at arms. But this seems pretty large now. I mean, it's not unrealistic, but you have to think that many of these troops it's about their availability, really, because some of them would just pay for their military service. Some of them enjoyed the scutage payment system, so that they could simply pay someone else to go fight in their place, or directly paying the Duke to, for that eventually would use this money for, I don't know, maybe raising the ordinances. That was the thing. And generally speaking, there doesn't seem that the feudal levies of Burgundy were very effective, but this is somewhat debatable. But let's say that at least they were not particularly committed. For example, at the Battle of Montlhéry in 1465, Philippe de Comines states that there were only 50 men at arms among the 1,200, or something like that had to that knew actually how to couch the lance into the arête, right? So there were people who were at this point heavily gentrified, that they didn't practice arms regularly. Also were summoned relatively rarely. They were not professional military men, and probably part of the reason why the Ordinance developed is exactly that, that there was this general lack of commitment, that it was a pretty heavy demand to ask for these feudal levies to participate. It was a great problem of the feudal system of recruitment, that every time these guys had to be paid for going to war, and they didn't care. Burgundy was freaking rich. It was engaged in many other activities rather than just war. These guys had money, actually, not to that they could pay for someone else to fight for them. Right? So, and this explains partly also why certain regions that were more intensely still feudalized and relatively poorer were so important to the Burgundian army. For example, Savoy that before we have mentioned was Savoy was allied of the Burgundians during the Swiss Wars, for example. And always the usual Philippe de Comines writes that by 1476 Charles the Bold disposed of the Savoyard troops as if they were his own. There was this strong commitment, and actually they had a common goal, because, as you know, the rise of the Swiss Confederation had caused problems to the neighbors that were incidentally Burgundy and Savoy. Savoy had lost actually lots of lands to the Swiss since the beginning of the 15th century. So it was a kind of a they had all the reason to side with Burgundy, and Savoy was pretty heavily feudal and warlike power at that time. So that partly explains why also these foreign connections, because evidently the local Burgundian element was not so interested in arms for these socio-economical reasons we hypothesize. So the going back on the quality of the feudal levies of Burgundy, also the equipment was seemingly relatively low. There were a very few breastplates and a very few valets, actually. So this means that noblemen also didn't quite they were very well equipped. The explanation said by Comines is because the House of Burgundy had been so long in peace, or at least the territory of Burgundy had been, so that but it also probably for the wars in the most recent times previously to Charles the Bold, were all the mercenaries that in the previous generations had been employed during the 100 Years' War now had costed a lot. They were disbanded, so to relieve the people from the tax burdens. So, and this had happened at the time of the Duke Philip the Good, actually. So, it seems that the feudal levy took even a freaking lot to mobilize, right? Over 2 months, for example, in 1467, and with certain contingents that basically never arrived. This was also typical feudal Europe in some way, but this is evidently particularly pronounced in here. And similarly, also their morale was pretty low. They complained about the terms of service, and there was this idea that of course the nobility of Burgundy had traditionally this strong military ethos, and therefore they wanted basically to be paid even in peacetime, not for the sake of military service in return, but just for showing that they were the Burgundian aristocracy. And definitely in Burgundy, aristocracy, the feudal aristocracy was important, right? And there's also Charles the Bold Chancellor that in 1473 calculated that in addition to the feudal array, the Duke required, in order to fight the French 1,200 lances of the Ordinance, another 1,000 lances, and further 800 to 1,000 lances in order to garrison the frontier. So that you realize that something within the state was not particularly functional, and that parts of the overall failure of the Burgundian army during the Swiss wars could be attributed to this, because the ordinance in itself was not everything after all, as we've seen, and at the same time there was this heavy external dependence of Burgundy on this element. So much also had to do from the international relations in general at that point. Naturally, Burgundy in this sense was also relatively lucky that France was now, after the 100 Years' War, expanding and warring many of its neighbors, so that these would look upon Burgundy as the most immediate ally to search, as they were basically within the same fronts, very close. But otherwise, as you know, with the Swiss, the defeat against the Swiss, the Burgundy was endlessly depleted for all the military expenses, the defeat, etc., and it was conquered, at least in its French domains, by the French crown, right? Taken back, because technically speaking, they were part of the French vassals at the end of the day, and this would continue, during the Habsburgs. For example, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was theoretically, as Duke of Burgundy, a vassal of the French king, as Duke of Burgundy, and this was something somewhat ironic in that context, at least if you know it, which I think so. And and these are big numbers. I mean, the fact that these French troops were required, and this heavy, we're talking about thousands of lakhs in here to garrison the frontier. Like, it's a huge expense, so it's no joke. And talking about the Low Countries that we mentioned before, the Flemish town militias were no better committed to the Burgundian cause. Actually, the Flanders had, under the Burgundian domination, kind of a good time, in the sense that they got some sort of progressive homogenization of the local politics. There was a sort of proto-national sense developing there, even through the Burgundian administration, that tried to homogenize everything a little bit. And this gave them, in fact, even the capabilities to exist as something on their own. But when it came to military service, also they didn't like, and this was normal, because town militias were non-professionals by definition, so they didn't give a damn as commoners about the military service. These were, old great city republics were enormously tight-fisted. Even if they were pretty wealthy, and the Flemish town militias would provide the chiefly infantry, as you can imagine, not only telling the truth, but they were predominantly about pikemen, foot pikemen, of course, and they could field substantially large contingents in Burgundian service. For example, at Amiens in 1471, they're also close naturally to these cities. So the range of employment is important as well, to consider how long, and because being non-professionals, they also had problems in the organization. They were not meant to stay under the Duke's service for too long. But there are up to 400 to 500 pikemen, which is interesting because it shows you that, remember when we were looking at the pikemen in the ordinances, there were fairly few, right? In here instead, Burgundy could access pretty large bodies of pikemen. This is something that would have worked if it had been about, like the Swiss, like a strongly committed and professionally trained militia, but these were all but this, definitely. So it wasn't like that. And partly these cities would pay, just like the vassals would do for the scout. They were vassals properly themselves, actually, but they would pay for military in exchange for military service, right? And it seems that, however, they kept in general to participate to the army, at least up to 1476, so up to almost the end, basically, of the Valois Burgundy house, let's say. And in the same 1476, there are even 88,000 lowlanders infantrymen serving in Lorraine, the Burgundians, and 2,000 came from Flanders proper, and 2,000 from Brabant, 1,300 from Artois, and 1,000 from Hainaut. Now this is important because France was basically expanding towards that direction as well, so that probably increased their commitment to serve the Burgundians. But on these numbers, especially this total of 8,000, there is some doubt actually. And it's also interesting that these lowlander militias were sort of uniformed with the blue and white ducal colors, which, you know, usually the town militias were all but uniformed, regularly speaking. I made an entire video on the Burgundian so-called uniforms. Of course, the term is what it is. I mean, uniforms as we mean them in modern terms is a concept that we tend to make appear with the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden in the mid-17th, in the first half of the 17th century. But I made a video that is like uniforms of the Burgundian army, something like that, which I explained this a bit more in detail. They usually town militias had each own their, you know, the banners and the colors of their guilds and all this stuff. But it's interesting that the Duke of Burgundy had managed to partly uniform even these militiamen with the traditional ducal colors, blue and white, right? And so in 1471, these militias had also been organized into something around 100 men, so companies here as well, led by something like one or two men at arms from the near Castellani, with each 10 men are under a Disanier. Now this is interesting because the military history of Flanders, I made a video recently that is the Flemish armies of organization, but it's about the between the 11th and the 13th century, but it partly touches on the traditional Flemish organization, a bit of the history of what would be, you know, that basically the lowlands were Flanders being the county of Flanders being the most important element, were framed within this the feudal hierarchy still. In the first half of the 14th century they rebelled. There's a pretty bloody mess down there. They managed to defeat French cavalry. There are some very interesting innovations in the Flemish infantry at the time. But let's say that the feudal element in these areas remain fairly a lot, right? You know, these were all cities, intensely urbanized areas, but they never get completely emancipated, let's say, from the local Castellanis that were the ones that were theoretically in charge of the local districts within the cities existed, right? And it's interesting because if you look at the first at the development of Flemish armies during the first half of the 14th century, you realize that even these victories of Flemish infantry over French cavalry were partly directed by these feudal men-at-arms that were theoretically vassals of the French, etc., but they basically took the opportunity of these cities rebelling to actually siding with them, and therefore putting at disposal of these commoners that had never taken a weapon in their arms how to fight, right, and to organize them, militarily, to deploy them, to arrange them, to spur them, and so on. So it's interesting to find that still at the end of the 15th century, and under the Burgundian rule, there was this attempt of framing the militiamen under the control of let's say the guidance at least of these men-at-arms that, you know, were in relation now something like 1 to 50, 1 to 100. Then I don't know. And these companies of 100 men framed within the tents under the Disanier. of 10 men each. So this makes sense in many ways, because naturally also the Chatelain were the privileged interlocutors, I believe, in with the ducal crown at that point in the cities in here. However, in spite of this kind of military guidance under this substantially feudal elements of men-at-arms, the Flemish militias weren't, that much. The discipline was pretty low. I mean, they were not trained. I mean, there were commoners. Let's be honest about that. And what was worse is that they also were terribly proud about themselves. So they there was this sort of kind of attrition as well with the noblemen, because they allegedly they didn't respect them because they felt they were these glorious cities that had kind of demonstrated they could defeat even the flower of European cavalry, the French one, back in the day, even though at this point it's not that they had gone too far, as basically they were under a French rule, as Burgundy was. Obviously decentralized, but and we have made a freaking long list of troops that could be levied by the Duke of Burgundy, but how big were his armies at the end of the day? Because, the ordinances, for example, show that these were troops that evidently were meant to be a sort of response, at least, to the ineffectiveness of the local levies of the city militias. So an effort to go beyond towards something more regular. And if you consider the available manpower, also the wealth of Burgundy, Burgundian armies, especially the ones under Charles the Bold, were fairly small, right? In 1467 against Liège, he perhaps fielded something like 50,000 men. In 1474, 12,000 men at the siege of Neuss, right? Then, in spite of the enormous logistical effort, it's not an enormous number at the end of the day. I mean, there were armies of single cities sometimes in other parts of Europe that could levy more than that, honestly. And so it's also interesting that during the battles against the Swiss Confederation, Charles the Bold was basically outnumbered. If you look, for example, the Battle of Grandson, he had only 50,000 men. At Morat, something between 12,000-15,000, and Nancy, only 8,000. It's not really a lot. Actually, Philippe de Comines stresses that in this last battle of Nancy, there were only 4,000 men in Charles the Bold's army. Maybe an exaggeration, but it even adds that only 1,200 of them were fit to fight. So this is not really, we will have to analyze eventually battle by battle, so we will see this more effectively, but you realize that all those big numbers that were just on paper, and it would be interesting to look a bit more in detail to this. I'm personally no expert, but it could explain a lot. And the same source, by the way, says that Charles the Bold at Nancy forced the commanders, his commanders, to accept the fight, even though he had this small force, and morale was also pretty low. And we know how it ended, unfortunately, for Charles the Bold. And there is this other data we have for the battle. Let's say May 1476, so basically 1 month before the Battle of Morat. And this comes straight from the accounts of Charles, Treasurer of War. So it's a fairly accurate breakdown of the composition of the Burgundian army in this occasion. So let's give it a read. So here we have the mounted troops of the 12 ordnance companies that are 1,241 men-at-arms and 2,685 mounted archers. And the men-at-arms, given that the average on paper was 1,200, as we've seen, are at full strength, even with some extra, as well as the mounted archers, right? Because they had to be something like 3,000, right? And they are like 2,600. And the total of this represents therefore something like 27 companies, given that, as we've seen, each one was like between 99 and 100 officers. But I'm not sure, because they could have been as well as the whole 30 companies, but under strength. So I don't really know, but this is how they were organized. Then, looking at the mounted English archers that also participated, there were 1,377. Of these, 391 were actually archers of the guard that we have mentioned before, plus 4 companies that made up other 388 men that were put under guard duty, basically. So this adds up with the remaining. This last adds up with the remaining to a total of 985 men, right? And basically these sort of represent the remaining 9 archer units, actually, of the 12 ordnance companies, of 110 men per company. So actually, excuse me, before we said the mounted archer were 30, no, they were 35. So this is very important as well, or 36 actually. So yes, so basically what you see in here is that the mounted English archers compensated for the mounted archers of the Ordinance. Now this is interesting, because basically these were theoretically guard units that are associated to fill the gaps of the mounted archers of the Ordinance, which is interesting. The infantry, that is, it counts 3,709 men that are meant to represent 4 understrength divisions of 1,000 men each. And then there is some household infantry, other 736 men that are instead 8 understrength guard companies of 100 men. If you look at the total in here, you have basically 1,241 1,241 men-at-arms, 162 mounted archers, and 4,445 infantry. So this is here. The infantry is not really specified in its composition, and it would be interesting to know about this, because these are relatively solid numbers. I mean, you realize here the cavalry is more important, numerically speaking, and probably also tactically, but 4,000 infantry is not really few. It's almost half of the whole numbers, so it would be interesting, especially to see how many other men would here. However, just like the previous comparison of theoretical and actual strength from the 1472 Ordinance, from this list, once again, the couturier and the pages are missing, the page actually, and they would make theoretically for pretty large numbers, something up to 2,500. So also in here you see that infantry doesn't seem at the end of the day to have been so important. Plus, you should also count the men-at-arms of the ducal household that were something around 500, and other troops. from the feudal levies and from the Savoyards that were probably another couple of thousands, possibly also more. However, this is an interesting example how you don't have to be tricked by sources. We have two contemporary records for the Battle of Morat. So after 1 month, that counts actually within the Burgundian army 1,600 men-at-arms and 8,000 infantry and mounted archers. So these numbers are actually very accurate because they're very similar to what the treasurer's account really was. This is in fact 1,200 men-at-arms and 8,000 and let's say 8,500 between infantry and mounted archers, right? So you may be thinking that here the courtiers and the pages are not counted, and also in here you have in turn to be tricky once again, because it really could sometimes when you give the number of the men at arms you read them in the sources, some of them do not count in fact the total of the men, but just the single lances. So this could be one reason, so that counting the men at arms, they were ideally including this other 2,500 between courtier and page. But and there is an Italian ambassador, Gianpietro Panigarola, who says that Charles on this occasion had 1,800 lances, right? And this was a term, especially in Italian sources, meant, I think at that time exactly that, one lance equated to to 3 or more, the same number, which, however, is not necessarily the case. And in fact, the same source says that only 1,000 of them were saved. So they had suffered 800 losses. And when we're talking about losses, it's definitely more sensible to think he's talking about the individual men. Like, how do you count actually in a battle? It's not that the individual lance was killed all at once. Someone could be saved or not. So this would be interesting to deepen actually. By the end of 1476, it's also interesting that the Ordinance companies' numbers had, become radically depleted, and there is this review held just a month before the Battle of Nancy, in which the number of men-at-arms is 1,136. So this has fallen compared to the treasurer's account of roughly a bit more than 100 men. The mounted archer and infantry elements fell respectively to 788 to 2,463, which is a freaking heavy loss. I mean, for the mounted archers, it's more than one half, and basically almost one half for the infantry. And this is particularly meaningful. I mean, it looks like especially the mounted archers suffered, either deserted actually, because this doesn't necessarily mean just the people who were killed. This is just a review. Many might have even fled actually. And so, and it's easier to do it if you're a mounted archer than an infantryman, of course. And looking at the list of the companies, you realize that of the original 100 men, they had fallen to 50 to 60. So even the Burgundian army that faced the Swiss at Nancy to get defeated. Naturally, you understand that Comines was right. He was a small army and also pretty demoralized one. So it's a thing here to remember, and this partly explains. I admit that before reading this stuff, I had always wondered, what about this tactical system, how complicated it was. But looking at the numbers now, you realize there was something going on that probably doesn't explain everything, and it would be interesting to deepen about the resources that were invested in this ordinance at this point, the commitment, etc. But we will, maybe if you know something just in detail, just write it down, because it would be really interesting to know. And maybe we will talk about the artillery later, because another time at least, because it's not dramatically important, but let's say that it also played its role, and let's say especially it seems that the Burgundians fielded a pretty large amount of guns, as we were saying, so they were pretty advanced under that point of view as well. But still, think about the cost here and the logistical demands, etc. So, but we'll look at that another occasion. And I think it was interesting to look at these details, frankly, because they show you I think more than else, the theoretical and actual strength, and also shows you particular logic behind both the numbers and the theoretical numbers, but also and especially the actual ones, and how they evolved and how the system transformed, and how gaps were compensated. This reliance, especially on foreign troops, as we have seen, has proved crucial. They were also partly integrated to fill the gaps of the ordinance proper, not just behaving like an external thing, especially the English mounted archers. Well, okay, there would be a lot else to say, but for now, say it's everything, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.